When the sun sets over the 7 hills. Rome never truly slept, but as the sun dipped behind the Janiculum hill, casting blood-red reflections over the Tiber, the city's face shifted. The chaotic vibrancy of the day, the merchants shouting in the forum, the hurried magistrates, and the carts clogging the narrow arteries, gave way to another Rome. This was a Rome that was darker, louder, and significantly more dangerous. Julius Caesar's laws had banned heavy-wheeled traffic during daylight hours to prevent gridlock, making the night the only time for heavy logistics. The sunset triggered a transformation. The streets became a thunderous avalanche of wood and iron. If you were an ordinary citizen trying to navigate home through the labyrinthine Subura district, you had to be as agile as a cat. Heavy wheels rumbled over the stone paving, and drivers cursed in dialects from every corner of the empire, creating a cacophony that made sleep impossible for those living in the insulae, the towering, rickety apartment blocks that seemed perpetually on the verge of collapse. In that violet hour, light was a luxury. While patricians retreated into their villas, illuminated by opulence and high-quality olive oil lamps, the rest of Rome plunged into a deep, velvety gloom. Walking the streets required a slave to carry a torch, if you could afford one, or you simply guided yourself by the pungent scent of roasting meat and cheap wine wafting from the taverns built into the ground floors of the tenements. The nocturnal city was a living organism defined by sharp contrasts. On one hand, you had the calculated serenity of the Palatine Hill, where the finest Chios wine flowed into silver chalices and poets recited verses beneath the gaze of marble statues. On the other, in districts like the Subura or Velabrum, the night was a carnival of raw instinct. There, tavern keepers watered down the wine, or served something that barely qualified as wine at all, while the patrons, soldiers on leave, sailors from Ostia, freedmen, and pickpockets, crowded into cramped rooms filled with the thick, oily smoke of pork griddles. The evening air was heavy, saturated with the dust stirred up during the day, mingling with the sharp tang of sewage and the faint, sweet scent of incense drifting from the shuttered temples. It was the hour when the night watch, the famous vigils, began their rounds. They were more than just police, they were firefighters and guardians of order, carrying buckets and axes, their eyes eternally fixed on chimneys belching suspicious smoke. A fire breaking out in the middle of the Roman night could reduce an entire district to ash before dawn. Yet, beyond the perils, the Roman night held an almost mystical charm. It was the moment when the city returned to the gods of the shadows. In the silence of the deep night, far from the roaring taverns, one could hear the whispers of history. Rome was not just stone and politics, it was a grand stage where, under the veil of darkness, humanity played out its oldest dramas: hunger, desire, fear, and the flickering hope that the next day might bring a better life. This was Rome at sunset. But as the stars climbed high over the Italian sky, the taverns began to ignite, and the true theatre of the night was only just raising its curtains. The tavern underworld and the clatter of dice. As darkness fully claimed the city, the true soul of Roman nightlife flickered into existence within the popini, the taverns. Unlike the exclusive dinner parties of the elite, the popini were the democratic melting pot of the Roman night. These were narrow, dimly lit shops opening directly onto the street, where the counter was the center of the universe. Behind it, a harried tavern keeper would ladle out watered-down wine seasoned with honey, spices, or even salt to mask the sourness of a vintage that had seen better days. For the common Roman, the plebs, the tavern was the living room, the kitchen, and the social club all rolled into one. If your apartment in an insula lacked a kitchen, which most did, given the constant fear of fire, you ate here. The smell of frying sausages, chickpeas, and garum, that pungent, fermented fish sauce the Romans loved, hung heavy in the air, clinging to the woolen tunics of the patrons. It was a space where social hierarchies blurred, though they never quite vanished. It was also in these smoky dens that the fever of gambling took hold. Romans were notorious gamblers, a passion that transcended class but thrived in the shadows of the night. You would hear the frantic rattle of tali, knuckle bones used as dice, against wooden tables or even the hard stone floor. The stakes were rarely gold for the average patron, they were coppers, a portion of the next day's grain ration, or sometimes, something far more desperate. Arguments were frequent and often turned violent, ending in knives being drawn or chairs being smashed before the vigils could intervene. In the corner of a popina, you might find a group of sailors recently arrived from the port of Ostia, their arms covered in maritime tattoos, speaking a mix of Latin and Greek, bragging about their voyages across the Mediterranean. Nearby, a group of off-duty soldiers might be drowning the monotony of camp life in wine, telling tall tales of the frontiers, of barbarians in the cold forests of Germania or the scorching sands of the East. The language was coarse, a street Latin peppered with slang that would have made a refined orator like Cicero shudder in his grave. Yet, there was a strange, raw community here. The knight stripped away the formality of the toga and the pretension of the forum. In the tavern, you weren't a citizen of a specific rank, you were a man looking for a momentary escape from the crushing weight of Roman poverty. You were looking for the camaraderie of the cup and the thrill of the gamble. However, the knight held deeper secrets. Beyond the wine and the dice, these establishments often served as fronts for other trades. In the shadows cast by the flickering oil lamps, deals were brokered, secrets were sold, and the underground economy of Rome, the black market for stolen goods and whispered political agendas, operated with the tacit, often bribed, consent of the local authorities. As the night deepened, the tavern wasn't just a place to drink, it was the nerve center of the city's hidden pulse. The lure of the shadows and the price of vice. As the night wore on, the boisterous energy of the taverns began to spill out into the narrow, winding alleys of the city. For those seeking something more intoxicating than wine or dice, the night offered darker avenues of indulgence. Rome was a city of extreme contrasts, and after midnight, the morality of the daytime, the Stoic lectures and the public processions seemed to evaporate, replaced by a frenetic urgency to experience pleasure before the dawn. The streets themselves became a different geography. A route that was straightforward at noon became a gauntlet of obstacles after dark. Filth often flowed in the gutters, and the risk of being doused with slops emptied from the upper windows of the insulae was a constant peril for any nocturnal traveler. Yet, the shadows were also a sanctuary for those whose business required anonymity. The back streets of the Subura and the dark alleys near the Circus Maximus were where the city's hidden desires found their expression. It was here that the influence of the East and the decadence of the provinces met. Brothels, or lupernaria, were marked by subtle symbols carved into the pavement or lanterns hung in specific configurations. Within these walls, the demographic of the night shifted again. You would find not just the desperate, but the curious and the bored, wealthy men masking their identities with simple hoods, seeking a thrill that their carefully managed domestic lives could not provide. The air inside these places was perfumed to mask the stench of the crowded city, and the atmosphere was one of calculated, transactional intimacy. For the wealthy, the night was managed behind closed doors. In the sprawling villas on the slopes of the Aventine, the elite hosted convivia, elaborate banquets that often stretched late into the evening. While the common man drank watered wine in a cramped tavern, the elite reclined on lecti, couches, in dining rooms adorned with frescoes, listening to hired musicians play the lyre or flute. These parties were performances of power. One did not just eat and drink, one displayed the rarity of the ingredients, the quality of the entertainers, and the exclusivity of the guest list. As the wine flowed, the conversation moved from the mundane to the scandalous, political gossip, backstabbing, and the latest fashions imported from the edges of the world. Yet, even these gilded halls were not immune to the insecurity of the night. A host knew that a stray comment, an insult delivered in a drunken stupor, or a poorly timed joke about the emperor could be reported by a disgruntled slave by morning. The night in Rome was a time of heightened senses and heightened anxiety. Every door held a secret, Every conversation carried a risk, and every participant in the city's nightlife was playing a high-stakes game where the currency was reputation, safety, and ultimately, survival. As the night approached its zenith, the quiet tension of the city was held together by the presence of the vigils. These men were not the typical soldiers of the legions, nor were they the elite Praetorian Guard who stood watch over the emperor. They were a unique institution, a hybrid of police and fire brigade, established to keep the capital from consuming itself. To walk the streets of Rome at 3 a.m. was to encounter these men frequently, their presence marked by the rhythmic clatter of iron-shod boots and the low, authoritative murmur of their patrols. The vigils were mostly recruited from the ranks of freedmen, and their job was arguably the most thankless in the entire empire. They patrolled in groups, armed with staves, short swords, and the tools of their trade, hammer-tea, buckets, sponges on long poles, and even ballistae mounted on carts to pull down burning structures if a fire spread too rapidly. For the average citizen, the sight of a vigil was a mixed blessing. They provided a modicum of protection against the violent gangs that prowled the darkness, yet they were also the eyes and ears of the state. To be stopped by a patrol in a dark alley was an unnerving experience. They had the power to detain, to question, and to judge the sobriety and intentions of anyone wandering too far from home. Their work was defined by the terrifying threat of fire. In a city of cramped wood and mortar buildings, a single spark from an overturned lamp or a neglected cooking hearth could turn an entire block into a furnace. The night watchmen lived in a state of perpetual vigilance, their senses attuned to the scent of smoke long before the orange glow of a fire could be seen reflecting against the night sky. When an alarm was raised, the narrow streets would erupt with chaos, the shouting of the watchmen, the clanging of buckets, and the terrified cries of families fleeing their crumbling homes. But the night also offered a strange kind of freedom to these guards. Away from the strict military discipline of the barracks, the vigils saw the real Rome. They witnessed the secret trysts in the doorways of the temples, the illicit deals made in the dark corners of the markets, and the quiet despair of the city's poorest residents. They were the ones who cleared the streets of bodies left behind by a brawl, and they were the ones who mediated disputes between tavern owners and their unruly patrons. Their existence was a stark reminder that even in the heart of the greatest civilization the world had ever known, order was a fragile construct. The night was a wild, untamed beast, and the vigils were merely the lion tamers, constantly pushing back against the encroaching tide of entropy, chaos, and flame that threatened to undo the grandeur of the eternal city every single night. As the sky began to bleed from an inky black to a bruised, dusty purple, the frantic energy of the Roman night began to wane. This was the most surreal hour of the cycle, the Tempus Silens, the silent time, before the city once again surrendered to the demands of the day. The taverns, once roaring with the sounds of laughter, arguments, and the clatter of dice, fell into a heavy, drunken stupor. The popini were now filled with the discarded remnants of the night, broken pottery, spilled wine pooling on the floors, and patrons slumped over tables, fast asleep in the cold air. In the streets, the change was palpable. The heavy supply carts, which had thundered through the darkness like iron beasts, had reached their destinations or retreated into hidden courtyards. The silence that followed was heavy and expectant. It was a brief window of time where the city seemed to hold its breath. This was the hour for the ghosts of the city to walk, the beggars who had spent the night in the shadows of the porticos, the street sweepers beginning their thankless tasks, and the slaves who crept out to fetch water from the public fountains before the morning crowds arrived. For those few hours, the distinction between the powerful and the wretched dissolved into the common fatigue of survival. A senator's carriage might rattle past, returning from a late-night debate or an illicit affair, and for a fleeting moment, the aristocrat inside would lock eyes with a street urchin huddled by a fountain. In the grey light of dawn, they were both simply tired souls living in a city that demanded everything from its inhabitants. There was a peculiar scent to this hour, the crisp, cool air of the morning mixing with the lingering, sour smell of the previous night's revelry. The temple bells began to toll, a slow, rhythmic sound that signaled the return of the gods to the public square. The vigils, their duty finally nearing its end, would hand over their posts to the daytime guards, their faces etched with the exhaustion of a shift spent staring into the abyss of the city's darkest secrets. As the sun began to crest the horizon, casting its first golden rays over the marble summits of the Capitoline Hill, the transformation was complete. The shadows that had hidden the sins, the deals, and the desperate struggles of the night were banished. The roar of the day was beginning to build once more, the clatter of sandals, the distant lowing of livestock, and the rising voices of the marketplace. The nocturnal face of Rome vanished as quickly as a dream, leaving behind only the faint echoes of the night, waiting patiently for the sun to set once again, so that the eternal, hidden pulse of the city could beat anew. While the sun dictated the official economy of Rome, the night hosted a shadow market that was just as vital and infinitely more complex. Once the streets were cleared of the daytime crowds, the true logistics experts emerged. This was not just about local deliveries, it was a vast, subterranean web of supply and demand that kept the sprawling metropolis fed, clothed, and entertained. The night was the realm of the negotiators, the middlemen who dealt in goods that couldn't survive the scrutiny of the bright midday sun. Luxury items, smuggled spices from the distant east, and exotic animals for the Colosseum Games often moved through the city under the cover of darkness. The city gates, usually heavily guarded by day to collect tariffs, became porous at night through the judicious application of bribes. A steady stream of pack mules and hooded merchants would slip through the posterns, bringing the wealth of the provinces directly into the storerooms of the wealthy or the secret warehouses of the Subura. However, this illicit trade relied on a fragile network of informants and specialized labor. You had the tabernarii, shopkeepers, who acted as fences for stolen property, the sailors who moonlighted as couriers, and the skilled thieves who knew precisely which villa doors were left unbolted by corrupt slaves. The currency of this world was as much about information as it was about denarii. To operate in the Roman night was to understand the value of a whisper. Who was in favor with the emperor? Which urban magistrate was accepting coins to look the other way? Which granary was currently unguarded? For the common worker, the operarii, this was also a time of labor. While the wealthy slept, the lower classes were often engaged in the endless maintenance of the city. The aqueducts needed constant repair, the massive stone foundations required inspection, and the city's refuse needed to be carted away to the puticuli, the mass pits outside the city walls. These nocturnal labours were the invisible engine of Rome. They worked in the damp, echoing tunnels beneath the streets, lit only by flickering, smoky torches, performing the back-breaking tasks that made the grandeur of the marble monuments possible. These labours rarely interacted with the elite, yet their worlds were inextricably linked. The senator who walked on a perfectly paved street in the morning owed his comfort to the labourers who spent their night in the muck. It was a symbiotic, if starkly unequal, existence. As the night deepened, this economic cycle turned with the relentless precision of a water clock. The night was not merely a time for debauchery or rest, it was a high-stakes, industrial enterprise. It was the time when Rome's hidden machinery clanked, groaned, and hummed, ensuring that when the sun finally rose, the facade of the eternal city remained perfectly, immaculately intact. To truly understand the night in Rome, one must listen not to the noise, but to the silence that lay beneath it. The city was a sonic landscape of immense complexity. Even in the deepest hours, when the taverns had quieted, the air was never truly still. There was the constant, low-frequency hum of a million people living in close proximity, the settling of wood in the crowded insulae, the distant, rhythmic barking of stray dogs competing for territory, and the occasional, sharp cry that pierced the darkness, leaving one to wonder if it was merely a nightmare or something more sinister. In the silence, the architecture of Rome took on a different character. The grand monuments, the Pantheon, the Forum of Augustus, the great temples, were no longer symbols of power, but gargantuan, hulking silhouettes that dominated the skyline. For a lone traveler, walking past the massive columns of a temple at midnight was an exercise in vulnerability. The sheer scale of the stone, cold and unyielding, served as a reminder of how small and fragile a single human life was against the backdrop of the empire. This was also the hour when fear became a tangible presence. Romans were a superstitious people, and the night was considered the domain of the lemures, the restless spirits of the dead. It was believed that the lemures wandered the earth during the night, seeking solace or causing mischief for the living. This fear dictated behavior. People were reluctant to venture out alone, and those who did carried amulets or muttered protective charms. The dark was not just an absence of light, it was a space populated by the unseen. Within the cramped living quarters of the poor, these fears were compounded by the claustrophobia of their existence. Families lived together in small rooms, and in the stillness of the night, every sound was amplified: the breathing of children, the creaking of floorboards, the muffled arguments from neighbors through thin walls. There was no true privacy. The night was a time of shared anxiety, a communal experience of waiting for the sun to return and bring with it the safety of the public eye. Yet, there was also a profound beauty in this nightly stillness. Occasionally, the moon would break through the clouds, casting a silver pallor over the white marble of the city, transforming the grimy streets into a dreamscape of light and shadow. In those moments, one could almost forget the stench, the danger, and the crushing poverty. One could look up at the same stars that had watched over the founding of the city and feel a connection to the vastness of time. It was a fleeting, fragile peace, a brief pause in the relentless rhythm of Roman life, before the inevitable, clamorous return of the morning light. As the night progressed, the streets of Rome became a stage for a grand, silent masquerade. In a society defined by strict social hierarchies, wear your toga, your ring, and your place at the theatre declared your rank to all, the night was the great equalizer, largely because it offered the gift of anonymity. When the sun went down, the rigid labels of patrician, knight, and plebeian began to blur. A hooded cloak was the most valuable garment in the city after dark. This was the time for the personae, the masks. It wasn't just the professional actors who wore them, every citizen who ventured out at night donned a psychological mask of sorts. A wealthy merchant might discard his expensive signet ring and don a coarse wool cloak to visit the seedier taverns of the Suburra, seeking to experience the raw, unfiltered life of the masses without the burden of his reputation. Conversely, a slave or a freedman might mimic the gait and speech of a citizen, hoping that the darkness would hide the seams of their deception. The night was the playground of the incognito. It was a time when the powerful could engage in activities that would lead to public scandal if performed by day. One might find a young noble gambling away his family fortune in a basement den, or a respected matron slipping through a side door to consult a fortune teller or a clandestine oracle. The darkness provided a layer of plausible deniability. As long as the sun hadn't risen, one could claim to be anywhere, doing anything, or more importantly, nowhere at all. However, this anonymity was a double-edged sword. While it protected the reputation of the highborn, it left the vulnerable exposed. The dark was the perfect cover for those who preyed on others, for criminals who thrived on the lack of witnesses. The vigils were always on the lookout for suspicious figures, but in a city of nearly 1 million people, it was impossible to track everyone. A person could disappear into an alleyway as a nobody and emerge as someone else, or they could vanish entirely, swallowed by the labyrinthine depths of the city. This constant shifting of identities gave the Roman night a tense, electrifying atmosphere. Every encounter was a gamble. Was that hooded figure a friend, a foe, or a stranger with a hidden agenda? The paranoia that accompanied the transition from day to night was a visceral part of the urban experience. Romans lived with the constant awareness that the person standing next to them in the dark might not be who they claimed to be. It was a world of whispers, hidden faces, and transient lives, a nocturnal dance where the only truth was that, once the lights went out, everyone was playing a part. While the taverns roared with life and the streets pulsed with clandestine trade, there existed another layer to the Roman night, a layer that was entirely unseen by the average citizen. This was the world of the religio licita versus the superstitio. While the great temples of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva were shuttered and locked at dusk, the night was when the unofficial gods and goddesses were invoked. Rome was a city of 1,000 shrines, but it was in the dead of night that the true, visceral connection between the Roman people and the divine often took place. In the damp basements of private homes or in hidden caves along the banks of the Tiber, small, frantic groups gathered for the rites of foreign deities, cults that had traveled with the legions from the farthest reaches of the empire. These were not the calm, ordered sacrifices of the state religion. These were ceremonies of blood, incense, and ecstatic chanting. Participants sought the favor of gods like Isis, Cybele, or the mysteries of Mithras, looking for promises of salvation and afterlife that the cold, civic religion of the Republic did not provide. The fear of these cults was palpable among the ruling class. The Senate frequently passed decrees to suppress these nocturnal assemblies, viewing them as hotbeds of conspiracy and moral decay. Yet, the tighter they clamped down, the more the night seemed to embrace them. To participate in these rites was to mark oneself as an outsider, to be part of an invisible network that spanned the entire city. The sound of a drum beating in the deep night, or the faint, heavy smell of exotic perfumes wafting through a garden wall, were the only signs that these rituals were underway. For the common Roman, these forbidden rites offered a sense of agency. In a life where your path was often dictated by your birth, your master, or your status, the night offered a place where the gods could be persuaded. People came to these hidden meetings with their deepest worries, a child's illness, a failing business, a hopeless love. They brought offerings, simple clay lamps, small coins, or handwritten curses on lead tablets, known as depictions. These tablets were the dark counterparts to the votive offerings of the day. A person might bury a cursed tablet near a grave or in a temple foundation, calling upon the gods of the underworld to bind an enemy, to bring misfortune to a rival, or to ensure that a secret remained buried. The night, therefore, was not just a time of sin, but a time of profound spiritual desperation. It was when the veneer of Roman civilization was peeled back, revealing a society deeply concerned with the supernatural. As the participants emerged from these hidden chambers into the cold morning air, they did so with the weight of their secrets and the hope that they had finally, in the darkest hour, secured the favor they so desperately needed. As the first faint light of dawn began to bleach the eastern sky, the city of Rome underwent its most jarring transformation, the death of the night and the birth of the morning. This was not a gradual process, it was a sudden, violent reclamation of the streets by the demands of a new day. The silence that had reigned for these past few hours was shattered by the return of the life force of the empire. The transition began with the salutatio. In the grand houses of the wealthy, the patronus would emerge to receive his clients, the men who depended on him for their livelihood, their legal protection, or their daily bread. This morning ritual, the formal greeting, was the polar opposite of the clandestine world that had ruled just an hour before. In the daylight, everything was regulated, hierarchical, and performative. The chaos of the night, the gambling in the taverns, the secret rites, and the anonymous wanderings were shoved into the corners, masked by the crisp white folds of the formal toga. As the sun hit the rooftops of the insulae, the street vendors began their raucous calls. The smell of the night, the stale wine, the sweat, and the pungent incense was replaced by the smell of fresh bread, roasting grains, and the inevitable, omnipresent dust of the city. The carts that had moved under the cover of darkness now gave way to the throngs of pedestrians, creating a new kind of gridlock. The politicians made their way to the forum to debate the laws of the land, while the workers trudged to their stations, their faces tight with the fatigue of a sleepless night. For those who had spent the night in the depths of the Roman underworld, the morning was a reckoning. The secrets of the darkness now had to be carefully managed. The gambler hid his debts, the adulterer smoothed his toga, and the cultist burned their robes. The social mask of Rome was firmly back in place, polished and perfected. Yet, if you looked closely at the faces of the people passing in the street, you could still see the echoes of the night. A flicker of exhaustion in the eyes of a soldier, a nervous twitch in the hand of a merchant, a lingering shadow of the thrill or the terror of the hours that had passed. Rome was a city that lived a dual existence. It was a masterpiece of civic order and a den of primitive chaos, a monument to the sun and a creature of the moon. As the sun reached its zenith, the night felt like a dream, a feverish, distant memory that had no place in the bright, rational world of the Roman day. But the citizens knew, and the city itself knew, that it was only a temporary truce. The sun would eventually set, the shadows would lengthen, and the great, hidden pulse of Rome would begin to beat once again.